This week, Donald Trump announced that the ceasefire with Iran was barely holding together, describing it as a truce already standing on borrowed time. But hidden inside that headline is a far more dangerous reality, and nearly every major media outlet has completely failed to recognize it. The gravest threat emerging from this confrontation is not the one dominating press conferences in Washington or filling television debates in Tel Aviv. The true danger is quieter than that, slower, more deliberate. And when it finally arrives, it will not resemble the wars people have grown used to watching unfold on their screens. There will be no sudden eruption, no dramatic declaration, no roaring beginning. It starts with silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of systems collapsing one by one. A port that suddenly stops operating. A highway severed so completely that an entire nation can no longer move supplies between critical regions. A runway reduced to broken concrete, incapable of receiving the massive transport aircraft it was designed for. And once that silence spreads across the region, the most technologically advanced military force in the Middle East may discover that it possesses only a handful of days before its own operational power begins turning against itself. Listen carefully, because this is not political theater. This is mathematics, cold operational mathematics, the kind that determines whether a modern military survives or slowly suffocates under the weight of its own consumption. For months, serious military strategists have been discussing a scenario behind closed doors, a discussion most political leaders across the Atlantic world have either avoided, underestimated, or feared, speaking aloud. That conversation centers on what Iran has truly been constructing beneath the spectacle of satellite photos, missile footage, and drone interceptions that dominate international headlines. When you stop focusing on the theater and instead examine the operational patterns with the detached perspective of someone who understands how armies genuinely function, not how they appear in campaign speeches or official briefings, an entirely different picture comes into focus. And for those willing to confront it honestly, the implications are deeply unsettling. Modern warfare is not powered by bravery alone. Courage may inspire monuments and memorials, but no military machine survives on sentiment. Armies survive on logistics. They survive on fuel counted in hundreds of thousands of liters for every brigade engaged in daily combat operations. They survive on artillery shells, consumed by the thousands within only a few hours of continuous engagement. They depend on endless flows of food, medical equipment, spare components, water, aviation fuel, and ammunition moving through invisible networks of ports, rail systems, depots, highways, and industrial infrastructure. Remove that network, and even the most advanced weapon platforms on Earth become nothing more than gigantic, immobile chunks of metal within days. The Roman legions understood this reality 2,000 years ago. Napoleon learned it catastrophically during the retreat from Moscow. The German Wehrmacht encountered the same brutal lesson across the vast Russian steppes. And now, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, an adversary appears to have spent years studying this exact vulnerability with extraordinary discipline and remarkable patience. An advisor connected to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps recently declared publicly that Iran's military infrastructure is so extensive the world has not yet witnessed the majority of its capabilities. That same official claimed Tehran possesses enough strike capacity to launch attacks against Israel every day for 2 full years without exhausting its arsenal. Think carefully about that statement. Not several weeks, not a few months, 2 entire years of sustained daily strikes. Yet governments across the West remain overwhelmingly focused on interception percentages, Iron Dome statistics, and missile defense success rates, as though the central question is simply whether individual projectiles penetrate Israeli defenses. That misses the strategic reality completely. The defining issue is not the interception rate. The defining issue is what happens when Iran shifts its targeting priorities away from military installations and toward the infrastructure that keeps those installations alive in the first place. Operational data gathered during the opening phase of the 2026 conflict reveal that Iranian missile strikes continued across multiple consecutive days without interruption. Even while Israeli air power conducted repeated attacks against launch sites inside Iran, the barrage persisted. Tehran absorbed the pressure and continued probing methodically. It measured response intervals with extraordinary precision. It evaluated radar blind spots. It tracked which targets triggered which defensive deployments. Every missile wave served 2 purposes simultaneously. It functioned both as a weapon and as a reconnaissance instrument. The patience visible inside the operational behavior does not resemble the conduct of a government acting out of panic or desperation. It reflects the mindset of a state convinced that time, endurance, and target selection are ultimately working in its favor. Israel depends heavily on 3 primary ports for external military resupply: Haifa in the north, Ashdod along the Mediterranean coastline, and Eilat on the Red Sea. Together, those facilities form the central arteries through which strategic sustainment enters the country. Their importance goes far beyond ordinary logistics. Their function is existential. Without operational ports, Israel loses the ability to receive massive ammunition deliveries, heavy armored equipment, aviation fuel shipments, and the immense tonnage modern warfare consumes at relentless speed. The critical targeting problem Iran appears to have been quietly studying through months of probing attacks is no longer whether those ports can be struck. Evidence already suggests that capability exists. The deeper question is whether Iran can systematically destroy the precise infrastructure required for maritime resupply to function at all. Can they cripple the cranes responsible for unloading cargo? Can they destroy the fuel transfer systems? Can they sever rail connections leading inland? Can they eliminate bonded staging areas where incoming military shipments are processed and distributed? And can they do all of this with enough precision and sustained pressure that maritime resupply becomes effectively impossible, regardless of how many vessels Washington sends into the region? This is not fantasy. It is pattern recognition based on observable operational behavior. The issue is no longer whether Tehran has developed such capabilities. Every available indicator suggests it has. The question that should be terrifying serious strategists is far simpler and far darker than that. Under what exact circumstances will Iran decide the moment has arrived to use them fully? If you are among the people who still believe the public deserves something more substantial than comforting illusions disguised as professional analysis, then understand this carefully, because the next layer of this conflict is precisely the part Washington would prefer the public never fully grasp. Trump now says the ceasefire with Iran is barely surviving. In response, the Speaker of the Iranian parliament declared that the military forces of the Islamic Republic stand fully prepared to deliver punishment against any aggressor. But observers who understand how strategic conflicts actually unfold are noticing something the non-stop media cycle is fundamentally incapable of processing. The rhetoric is irrelevant. Words are noise. Political language exists primarily to calm domestic audiences while projecting determination abroad. The truly important signals are not hidden in speeches. They are hidden inside targeting geometry, inside the precise and disciplined selection of what Iran has attacked, and even more importantly, what it has intentionally avoided attacking. Because within that restraint sits the clearest military message Tehran is communicating right now, and much of the Western strategic establishment continues to misread it entirely. Look at the operational mathematics of military sustainment, because this is where theoretical strategy collides with the unforgiving physical realities armies face in actual combat. An Israeli armored brigade engaged in active operations does not burn fuel the way civilian transportation systems do. Its daily consumption reaches roughly 18,000 liters. The total includes tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, self-propelled artillery systems, engineering platforms, and the supply convoys required to keep the brigade functioning. Expand that figure across the total number of armored formations Israel currently has deployed, and the daily fuel requirement rapidly climbs into the millions of liters. Israeli frontline formations maintain enough stored fuel to continue operations for perhaps 3 to 5 days. That reserve exists as a temporary cushion against short disruptions. It was never intended to support combat operations after the logistics network itself has been cut apart at the source. Artillery introduces an equally brutal mathematical equation. A single artillery battalion, firing continuously, can expend hundreds of shells during only 1 day of combat. Multiply that across every artillery platform currently active, and ammunition consumption quickly rises into the thousands of rounds every day. Add tank ammunition, anti-tank guided missiles, mortar systems, and precision-guided air-launched weapons, and the scale becomes enormous, almost beyond comprehension. Forward, ammunition depots exist for one reason. They allow military operations to continue while resupply from rear logistics areas keeps moving forward. But if that movement stops completely, and if those depots themselves come under attack, if storage magazines erupt in flames while transport trucks become immobilized because bridges no longer exist, then the ammunition a military unit physically possesses at the exact moment of interdiction becomes the totality of what it will ever possess afterward. Once those supplies are consumed, they are gone. Now consider what Iranian targeting doctrine would likely look like if Tehran fully transitions toward logistics infrastructure warfare. The first phase would not involve dramatically sinking ships at sea. That belongs in Hollywood films, not operational military planning. The opening phase would instead focus on destroying the exact mechanical systems and civil infrastructure required to transfer cargo from ships onto Israeli territory. Container cranes, fuel unloading systems, rail terminals, bonded storage facilities. Destroy those mechanisms, and the vessels sitting offshore become meaningless. Their cargo may as well not exist because it can no longer be accessed. The second phase would avoid wasting expensive missiles on isolated vehicles driving through the country. That approach is inefficient and strategically shallow. Instead, the strikes would focus on infrastructure that logistics traffic cannot bypass. Bridge crossings along primary supply corridors, rail bridges, highway overpasses. tunnel systems functioning as unavoidable choke points. When a bridge is destroyed, the impact extends far beyond the vehicles crossing it at that moment. Every vehicle dependent on that route stops moving until reconstruction occurs. And inside a country the size of Israel, where the number of major north, south, and east-west transportation corridors is inherently limited, destroying several bridges simultaneously does not merely create congestion, it creates strangulation. When Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz following the United States-Israeli strikes in February of 2026, it demonstrated this exact philosophy of infrastructure warfare. The objective was not direct destruction of armies. The objective was cutting the arteries feeding those armies. Apply that same operational logic internally against Israel's logistics network, and the concept evolves from blockade into a tightening vice. Gradual, methodical, almost invisible at first, until the military force dependent on that network discovers it can no longer sustain itself in the field. Then comes the third phase, the most unsettling portion of the entire analysis, because it directly challenges one of the most comforting assumptions modern states cling to, the belief that classified information automatically guarantees security. Israel maintains a dispersed network of hardened forward logistics depots containing prepositioned fuel, ammunition, and operational supplies specifically designed to sustain military activity whenever rear logistics systems come under severe pressure. The locations of those facilities are among the most heavily protected secrets within Israeli defense planning. Yet recent Iranian strikes repeatedly hit facilities whose military purpose had never been publicly acknowledged. Later, satellite imagery revealed ammunition bunkers, fuel storage farms, and prepositioned military equipment at those exact locations. Targeting intelligence of that quality does not emerge accidentally. It reflects years of deliberate battlefield preparation through human intelligence networks, signals intelligence collection, and commercial satellite image analysis, carried out with a level of patience and thoroughness Western assessments appear to have consistently underestimated. And then comes the emergency solution. American planners instinctively turn toward whenever logistics vulnerability becomes impossible to ignore. Strategic airlift. The United States possesses enormous heavy airlift capability through aircraft, such as the C-17 Globemaster and the C-5 Galaxy, both capable of transporting tremendous cargo loads across intercontinental distances. But strategic airlift depends entirely on functioning airfields, equipped with runways long enough and structurally intact enough to receive heavy aircraft safely. During the 2026 conflict, Iranian missile strikes forced the closure of Israeli airspace for several days, severely disrupting operations at Ben Gurion and multiple additional airports throughout the country. Iranian planners understand something with complete precision. A runway does not need to be permanently destroyed in order to become operationally useless. To disable a runway, an attacker does not need to erase an entire airport from existence. The objective is far simpler and far more efficient. All that is required is the creation of enough deep subsurface craters across the landing surface to make heavy aircraft operations unsafe. If strikes achieve that effect at Ben Gurion, Ramon, and the key Israeli Air Force installations, then American strategic airlift becomes meaningless no matter how many cargo aircraft are waiting at Dover or Travis prepared for deployment. As of May 15, 2026, Iran publicly stated that no agreement had been reached with the United States regarding uranium enrichment conditions. Nuclear negotiations remain frozen in deadlock. At the same time, Trump warned Tehran that it faced only two options: accept a deal or face annihilation. The language on both sides grows harsher with each passing day. Diplomatic communication is heating beyond the boiling point. Yet, the most important analytical question is not whether either side desires war in the abstract. Rational governments rarely seek catastrophic conflict voluntarily. The real question is whether the conditions for a historic miscalculation are now firmly in place. Has the distance between what each side believes the other will tolerate and what the other side will actually tolerate widened so dangerously that the next escalation no longer lands at a negotiating table, but instead explodes against a logistics depot Israel cannot survive without? That leads directly to the unavoidable question emerging from everything discussed so far. What exactly is Israel's answer? How does a state strategically respond when facing a systematic logistics interdiction campaign? And here, honesty becomes deeply uncomfortable for anyone emotionally invested in the myth of total Israeli military invulnerability. There is no clean answer. Not because Israeli military planners lack competence. Their professionalism is unquestionable. The problem is far deeper than individual planning failures. The vulnerabilities being targeted are structural. They are rooted inside geography itself. Israel is a relatively small country. Its access to ports is limited. Its road and rail corridors are finite. Meanwhile, its forward-deployed military formations consume supplies at rates that peacetime infrastructure systems were never designed to sustain under conditions of continuous precision strike warfare. Israel cannot fully stop Iranian missiles from reaching enough critical targets to accomplish logistics disruption objectives. Operational data already confirms that even while Israel conducted continuous air campaigns against Iranian launch infrastructure, Tehran maintained sustained missile fire into Israeli territory. Interception systems reduce damage. They do not eliminate it completely. They never have. They never will. And inside a logistics interdiction campaign, the attacker does not require perfect success, only sufficient success. The goal is not total destruction of every target. The goal is damaging enough critical nodes that the broader network ceases functioning as a coherent system. One destroyed crane at Haifa may not shut down the port entirely, but 3 destroyed cranes combined with damaged fuel unloading infrastructure and the loss of the primary rail connection feeding inland distribution networks could absolutely paralyze it. Nor can Israel rapidly repair the level of destruction a prolonged precision strike campaign against infrastructure would create. This is not ordinary road maintenance. These are specialized port systems requiring manufacturing timelines measured not in days but in months. These are bridge reconstructions demanding major civil engineering operations. These are cratered runways preventing heavy aircraft from landing safely. National morale cannot solve those problems quickly enough. Military discipline cannot solve them either. Operational timelines move faster than reconstruction timelines. The United States also cannot fully compensate through emergency resupply operations at the speed required to sustain active warfare. A single massive container vessel transports more cargo than dozens upon dozens of C-17 sorties combined. Attempting to sustain an army of 120,000 troops through airlift alone while ports remain disabled and runways remain cratered is not simply difficult. At the relevant operational scale, it becomes physically impossible. The conditional ceasefire announced on April 8th emerged only after weeks of devastating exchanges between both sides. Since then, negotiations have repeatedly broken down, resumed, stalled again, and fractured under pressure. The ceasefire achieved only one thing. It bought time. What it did not do was resolve the deeper strategic asymmetry underlying this entire confrontation. And yet, there is another point that must be stated clearly because intellectual honesty requires it. Deterrence does not equal inevitability. Iran has not yet fully executed the targeting campaign described throughout this analysis. Possessing the capability to conduct such an operation does not automatically mean the political decision to use it has already been made. Pakistan-mediated talks continue. Both sides have repeatedly returned to negotiations, even while disputes over ceasefire conditions remain intense and unresolved. Across multiple governments and institutions, there are individuals who fully understand the escalation logic unfolding here. Some are working with urgency, others with desperation, trying to prevent this chain reaction from reaching its final stage. But history teaches a harsh lesson that diplomatic optimism alone cannot erase. Capabilities that exist eventually tempt use. Strategic advantages built patiently across years of intelligence gathering and operational preparation do not simply disappear because negotiators continue meeting inside conference rooms in Pakistan. Those capabilities remain available. They remain operational. And above all, they remain tempting. The moment Tehran calculates that restraint carries greater cost than action, the option will still be waiting there. Pressure from domestic audiences, pressure from military commanders, pressure generated by the internal momentum of the conflict itself. All of these forces can eventually shift the calculation. And when that shift arrives, the infrastructure targets already mapped and studied for years may suddenly move from contingency planning into execution. What Washington and Tel Aviv owe their citizens is not reassurance. Offering reassurance while ignoring the evidence would amount to negligence disguised as leadership. What they owe instead is honesty. Honest recognition that a severe strategic vulnerability has developed. Honest acknowledgement that the opposing side has demonstrated both the capability and the intelligence preparation necessary to exploit it. And most importantly, acknowledgement that this vulnerability cannot be solved through additional interceptor missiles or another round of carefully worded diplomatic statements alone. It requires something much larger, a complete reassessment of how modern military power actually functions in reality, not in theoretical policy papers, not in sanitized think tank briefings, but in the brutal material world where armies survive, only if fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food, and logistics continue arriving every single day. When the shock finally comes, the true surprise will not be that it happened. The real shock will be that the warning signs were visible in plain sight to everyone paying attention, yet almost nobody in positions of authority was willing to describe the danger honestly, while there was still time to act. Now the question turns to you. Is Iran's ceasefire posture truly an attempt to preserve peace, or is it a calculated pause meant to prepare the next stage of the conflict? Share your perspective. This debate needs informed voices now more than ever. If you value deep geopolitical analysis that goes beyond headlines and talking points, stay connected for the next breakdown because the next phase of this crisis may already be taking shape beneath the surface. This analysis is presented strictly for educational discussion and geopolitical examination based on historical and strategic research.